They were doing something that had never been really heard in rock music before.
That sort of idea of I will escape the suburbs by sheer force of will and by flamboyant display, that to me seems to be central.
They didn't want to be liked. They didn't want to be like anyone else. There wasn't a plan. Sometimes there wasn't even a band. But somehow two suburban kids who never picked up an instrument until their late teens ended up changing the face of pop.
I'm not sure that bands and artists these days make changes so rapidly. It was very much like the Beatles from 63 to 68.
More than a punk band, more than a pop band, with a lead singer, Siouxsie Sioux, that inspired women and made men feel all sexy and submissive, both at the same time. From screaming the Lord's Prayer at a few hundred stunned punters to making 5 groundbreaking, thoroughly astonishing albums in just 5 short years, 1978 to 1982. This is the story of Siouxsie and the Banshees. I'm Miranda Sawyer, and on a warm day last summer, I was granted a rare interview with Susan Janet Ballion, aka Siouxsie Sioux. Although Siouxsie now lives in sunny France, we sat, as we should, in the dark. And yes, I was nervous. So, where are you from? From Chislehurst?
So I'm a child of the suburbs. Inside town, people are a lot more broad-minded, but the suburbs, it is so rigid. Flowers and gardens, it's pruned and it's all on the facade. It's all neat and held in check. So there's a lot to fight against.
The kind of philosophy, if you like, of the band was cemented very early on.
Siouxsie's co-creator of the band and bass player, Steven Severin.
We didn't want to be like anybody else. You know, even the first performance was saying, OK, well, everybody's talking about how it's all do-it-yourself and anybody can do it. Let's take it to its obvious extremes.
Now picked over as though it were a thought-out academic thesis, in the late 70s, punk was a howl of frustration, a visceral reaction against the British establishment and British pop music's overblown pretensions. By the winter of 1976, punk was rattling the establishment cage. The Sex Pistols' confrontational attitude led to fights breaking out during their gigs, offstage and on. Punk's leaders were the Sex Pistols, 4 inner-city whelps who made a straightforward enough racket, but whose singer, Johnny Rotten, voice like a dying animal, face like a beautiful gargoyle of hate, was one of the best frontmen music has ever seen. The Pistols attracted disaffected teenagers like Siouxsie and Steve, both part of the so-called Bromley Contingent that followed the Pistols wherever they performed. When an act pulled out of a gig at London's 100 Club on Oxford Street, Siouxsie told Malcolm McLaren, the Pistols' manager, that she and Steve would play.
The first gig was picking up an instrument, me standing on a stage for the first time. We kind of took the ethos of anything's possible and we taught ourselves.
We were just different from everybody else. It was just apparent right from the beginning. But everybody was different from each other at the beginning. You know, the Buzzcocks were different from the Pistols were different from the Clash, the Damned were different from everybody else. There wasn't this unifying approach by everybody that somehow has been rewritten, that it was some kind of, you know, this great movement. It wasn't like that at all.
Siouxsie and the Banshees biographer, Mark Patras.
Severin and Sue, they came from that, we like the Velvet Underground, we like the early Roxy music, we are more stylish than everybody else. A real sense of elitism, which was youth culture at its most powerful. At a time when everyone was just very, you know, cheesecloth shirts and denim, the landscape was very flat. And these characters weren't, you know, they had a really forceful personality. Even though they could hardly play, I mean, the gumption of getting up at the 100 Club and just basically inventing stuff till the crowd booed them off, which they didn't quite boo them off. They sort of half enjoyed it.
The Pistols' manager, Punk's artful dodger, Malcolm McLaren, revelled in the provocative. It was McLaren who arranged for the Pistols to appear on Thames TV's Today programme, an early evening magazine show, like a Regional 1 show, hosted by presenter Bill Grundy. Siouxsie, Severin and other Pistols fans came along too, and on December the 1st, 1976, the cosy tea-time format collided head-on with the mischief and mayhem of the Sex Pistols and their entourage.
We were invited up there. It was free sandwiches, definitely free booze. They were doing the show. We were standing behind them. And, you know, suddenly as it went on, he was being more and more condescending and patronising. From then on, the floodgates opened of swear words and he encouraged them, and it just went on and on from there. I just interjected, I've always wanted to see you, and not really, and kind of pulled a face. But the biggest shock was the response. I mean, you know, so what, a few swear words, and then we just ended up, you know, oh, great, let's have these sandwiches, drink these. And the phones, in this green room, the phones were all going. And it was people phoning in to complain about the language on the show. And they had Steve Jones, me, and anyone else picking up the phone saying, get a life. The next day, it was like the filth and the fury, people kicking in their TV sets.
If you look at it now, it looks kind of slightly sort of pathetic. It's like there's nothing, it doesn't look threatening. It doesn't look like the social order of Britain is going to come crumbling down as a result of this. It looks like a bunch of young blokes sort of swearing.
Journalist Alexis Petridis.
You also look at Bill Grundy and you think, how did this cause so much upset? But, you know, it's a long time ago and people had different standards then. This is an era, I suppose, where if you see a sitcom, very occasionally someone will say the word bloody, and there is an audible intake of breath from the studio audience as they laugh. You know, this is something really shocking has happened here. So I guess somebody going, you dirty. I could see why that caused outrage. What it would do, of course, is make punk rock seem incredibly appealing to anyone who wanted to annoy their parents.
The filth and the fury was the legendary Mirror headline after one outraged TV watcher kicked his telly in. But it wasn't just the punk attitude that was important, the music was too, and that had an invaluable mainstream champion. Late at night on Radio 1, you could hear punk's siren call, courtesy of DJ John Peel. Mark Patris remembers.
It was the John Peel sessions that did it. I think that's what I had. And I just played them on an old cassette again and again and again. Bedroom boys, friends round, listen to this.
So there's actually quite a big gap between Susan the Banshees, for example, playing at the punk festival at the 100 Club, which was in 1976, and putting their first single out. A band doing a Peel session used to be almost like an integral part of an alternative, in inverted commas, band's musical programme.
More of the same unpleasant and disorientating racket on tomorrow night's programme. Until then, from me, John Peel, good night and good riddance.
Siouxsie and the Banshees had press coverage. They had gigs, but they needed a single. And they found their inspiration back in suburbia, in the unlikely form of a Chislehurst Chinese takeaway. In August 1978, they released Hong Kong Garden, a stone-cold pop classic that showcased Siouxsie's outrageously dramatic voice, as well as the Banshees' peerless way with a catchy tune. It went to number 7 and brought the Banshees to the attention of Top of the Pops, and thus to the mainstream. It was the first time I'd ever seen them. Any Top of the Pops fans who bought the Banshees' first album, The Scream, might have been a little bewildered. Released on the back of a 6-week sold-out UK tour, The Scream showed the Banshees' true colours, and they were dark. Siouxsie's imperious vocals came from a distance. The guitar moved from jagged riffs to shimmery noise. There was a lot of space in there, and the sound was big and slow. Oh, and Hong Kong Garden? That wasn't even on the album.
I thought it was commercial, but I also knew, and that's why it wasn't on the album, I thought it didn't go with anything else. It was the thing that would pull people in that didn't want to be pulled in. And in a way, my spite said, yes, we'll get them with that. Then they'll get the scream, but go, oh my God.
There's always 2 or 3 key influences on each album. Certainly with the scream, it's J.G. Ballard and William Burroughs. We were just very aware that this kind of 1, 2, 3, 4 Ramones-based music wasn't going to last very long. We'd just come out of an era of glam rock, and so our influences were David Bowie and Roxy Music, both of whom did very diverse types of arrangements of songs. So, you know, we had no interest in talking about people on the dole. We'd been on the dole, it's boring.
Alexis Petridis.
Every one of David Bowie's albums between 1969 and 1980 is completely different from the one before. And that was the way that pop music used to be. You know, the idea was you ensnared an audience and kept an audience with novelty. I mean, novelty is in doing something different, doing something new. I think now there's a sense you ensnare people with familiarity and you present something people can recognise from the past. And then if you've got a winning formula, you tend to stick with it, because these are tough times and record companies don't really let you muck about.
Their second album, Join Hands, which took the very un-rock and roll topic of World War I as its inspiration, was different, more experimental, less abrasive, though still dark and jagged.
The idea of Field of Poppies represents the sheer numbers of loss, of flesh and blood, and the hopelessness as well. So at the same time, there were news reports from Iran and the Ayatollah and what was going on there, the suppression and repression curfews going on. And I think for the first time you've seen people killed and being shot on the TV. And it was a time of real instability, I think, 1979. I mean, even in London, you know, the rubbish was piling high. Right. I just think it was a real time of everything in flux and uncertain, but also festering underneath. And because of there was this stuff from the past that was just left there rotting there, and it needed to be acknowledged and then cleaned up, not just swept away, still rotting.
After chalking up another top 30 hit with Playground Twist and playing bigger and bigger gigs, the Banshees' interband tensions became intolerable. On tour in Aberdeen in late '79, with Robert Smith's band The Cure supporting, a petty argument topped off weeks of squabbling and nearly spelt the end for the band. Kenny Morris and John Mackay walked.
After the Scream and Join Hands, I definitely sensed the rift between me and Severin and John and Kenny. And the rift didn't heal. There was just me and Severin at soundcheck, no band and a gig to do. And we did the gig, and we did the Lord's Prayer, which in a way was great because Robert didn't know what it was.
So you did it. So basically, you didn't play a conventional Siouxsie and the Banshees
Not at
gig.
all.
What happened was that they had left and Robert Smith said, I'll come in and help you out. And
no,
you just
we asked, can you come and help us out?
Okay.
He didn't offer.
You dragged him on stage.
Yes.
And said, right, you're playing the Lord's Prayer.
You're coming on or else.
It was a mess. But Siouxsie and Severin were never going to give up. And their amazing progression from non-musicians in 1976 to musical innovators in 1979 led to them being courted by some of the finest musicians in the land, including magazine guitarist John McGeoch and drummer Pete Clark, a.k.a. Budgie. Mark Patras.
Well, the interesting thing about McGeoch and Budgie coming to the band is these were two extremely accomplished musicians, as opposed to the Banshees who just got by, the original Banshees who got by on inventiveness alone and enthusiasm. They brought real musical chops to the table.
John McGeoch had already been in Magazine, who were a very, Magazine were a band that were clearly ahead of what was going on.
Alexis Petridis.
McGeoch just does really interesting things on the guitar. His massive influence on Johnny Marr, for example. Not a man who claims a lot of antecedents.
He actually said he found it really refreshing working with non-musicians like me and Severin. He wasn't stuck up or snobby about, oh, they're not musicians, darling.
We mustn't forget how annoyed Sue and Severin were when the other two walked out. I think that made them look towards more mainstream audiences and more mainstream approval. And they started then to craft less angular music in general, but more sort of a hard pop, exotic, neo-psychedelic pop, I think.
Forcing up morning skies, Christine, the strawberry girl, Christine, banana split lady, Christine, the strawberry girl, Christine, banana split lady.
Today, it's hard to understand just what a sensation Sue caused back in the late 70s. It wasn't just her voice, it was how she looked. Clad in black vinyl drainpipes and slashed black t-shirt, with black eye makeup and a shock of crazy black hair, Susie's beauty was witch-like and bewitching. She was Bromley's Greta Garbo, if Garbo had ever got into bondage and eyeliner. Her image was, and still is, one of the most iconic in pop. I asked her about it.
At that time, I think when females were in bands or, solo artists, they were very much manipulated or an extension of some Svengali behind them. The truth is, I think I scared the hell out of a lot of people, and I quite like that.
We all think of Johnny Rotten and Sid Vicious as the sort of punk icons, but Siouxsie was really the female equivalent of those two, just as important, and there was as many Siouxsie lookalikes on the street in the late 70s, early 80s as there were Sid Vicious clones. It was such a recognisable, era-defining look.
Most people said, "Oh my God, did you see that?" To suddenly see that as an aspiration of people wanting to look like me, and it was quite creepy, and it almost made me want, do I go blonde and wear white?
She always presented herself as a very austere kind of person, which we thought of in a Bowie-esque Thin White Duke, but actually her presentation of self is much closer, I think, to the old Hollywood vamps like Dietrich, Garbo, these untouchable characters, really. They were created in and out of mythology, with faces like masks that were very, very difficult to read behind.
To those waiting with bated breath for that favourite media catchphrase, the U-turn, I have only one thing to say. U-turn if you want to. The ladies not for turning.
In 1980, the world seemed suddenly very different. Callaghan's Labour government had been replaced by Thatcher's Conservative regime, and the musical landscape changed as well. Influenced by electronic acts such as Kraftwerk, bands like the Human League and Soft Cell stepped into the limelight. The new Banshees, Siouxsie, Severin, McGeoch and Budgie, experimented with the new sounds, using drum machines and synths, and making another huge sonic leap with the album Kaleidoscope, which went in at number 5 in August 1980, the highest position the band ever achieved.
As much as we'd learned how to be musicians in those past 2 or 3 years, and learned how to be live musicians and learned how to be a band, we were now learning how to be proper songwriters.
Less than 12 months later, in June 1981, they released their dark masterpiece, Juju, one of the most influential British albums ever. Warmer, denser, faster, more dramatic.
For the first time since the Scream, all the songs were pretty much written and road tested before we went in to record Juju. We knew every single nook and cranny of those songs before we went in and did them. Arabian Nights, Spellbound, things like that. They were just ready to go.
Spellbound is my favourite Banshees track of all the ones I did, and I like a lot of them, but this one I particularly like.
Producer of Kaleidoscope and Juju, Nigel Gray.
There it is really a brilliant combination of John McGeoch's guitar melody and strength with a fantastic song. It opens up with a really haunting, like a Hitchcock movie starting out at the very beginning of it.
From the cradle bars comes a beckoning voice that sends spinning. You have no choice.
Then the guitar and everything comes in, and then Budgie's overdubbed drums come in.
Juju was another top 10 smash, and by now Siouxsie had become a genuine pop icon. Her style, once considered utterly outrageous, became almost commonplace as young women across Britain dyed their hair the colour of night and brandished crimpers like deadly weapons. By mixing the occult and the supernatural in their lyrics with imposing, hauntingly dark music, they'd unwittingly paved the way for a new genre, goth.
If you asked somebody in the 80s to draw a female goth, they would draw someone that looked like Siouxsie Sioux. If you look at goth generally, goth is kind of a flamboyant expression of a certain kind of suburban, maybe middle class, ennui or angst.
Well, it's like anything that gets pigeonholed and limiting it. Plus, it also makes it very easy for people to piggyback onto it and just dress things up that have no content, which is why I've always hated terminology of fashion of terminology.
To start with, they even described themselves as slightly gothic when they spoke about the second album. But I mean, they were very quick to withdraw that when you had Bauhaus and all these other kind of bands coming on, doing third-rate, Banshee-sounding things. You could even say Joy Division sort of followed on from them. And of course, they really quickly became to resent that. But at the same time, that whole goth subculture grew sort of around them. And you go to Siouxsie gigs in the early 80s, it was quite different to the late 70s, and every second girl had the Siouxsie hair. It was just extraordinary.
I don't really know why goth is seen as being a sort of joke, really. I mean, if you look at what goth is, if you look at what goth looks like, it's a kind of extension of the way punks looked. It's a slightly more romanticised version.
It took 5 years of creativity to turn a girl from the suburbs into a modern pop figurehead. 5 years for two non-musicians to zoom from not knowing which way to hold a guitar to creating pop masterpieces. 30 years ago, in November 1982, Siouxsie and the Banshees released the strange, sexy, psychedelic album A Kiss in the Dream House. It was influenced by something slightly more than mere music and art.
It was a great recreational drug. I only ever had fantastic funny times happen from it. Funny things, strange things, but I was never freaked out on LSD. I've heard of a lot of people that were and have been, but I loved it. Cocoon was very much me writing as I was coming down from a trip. You get ideas, and an idea can actually really grow during a trip.
They're very psychedelic records. My theory is that if it is 1981, 82, 83, and you're confronted by the sort of reality of Britain in those days, very right-wing government, there's been a war, there's recession, poverty, all this kind of thing. There's two ways to react to it. And one is to be the specials and attack that head on and protest about it. And the other, perhaps more inviting thing to do is to turn off your mind, relax and float downstream. But you could see why there's a lot of psychedelia under Thatcher.
It's also Dream House is an incredibly sexy album, which is something that we hadn't really explored before. So we knew that collectively we were building a kind of album identity. And that was something that was purely down to Siouxsie and I. That nobody else had any input into that arena. There were several factors at play that made it a kind of zenith.
A Kiss in the Dream House marked an end to this remarkable creative explosion. Though Siouxsie and the Banshees continued, making some excellent records along the way, it's arguable that nothing they did matched that initial mad inspiration, that astonishing acceleration of excellence, that wild, all-up-for-grabs originality.
You hear the progression from this very dark, angular album called The Scream, which was the debut. By the fifth album, you still had Severin's bubbling bass line, minimal but really strong and powerful, and Siouxsie's big, sort of Nico-esque kind of voice. But what you had was this more floral element of McGeoch and Budgie that came in by the third album that really opened up the sound and gave it this almost a neo-psychedelic twist, which we never would have expected in 1978.
Perhaps the Banshees need to be reclaimed. Many, like me, were put off the band due to the ludicrous goth fashion that trailed along behind them, like the flapping tails of a second-hand undertaker's coat. Yet if you listen to their first 5 albums with your mind open, your ears unclothed, all you hear is astonishingly futuristic, intelligent, innovative music.
They're quite an inimitable band, Siouxsie and the Banshees. They have such a striking image because Siouxsie is such a sort of strong figure at the front of the band. If you try and imitate them, it's going to come off quite badly. I think it's going to come off as a pastiche.
You hear LCD Sound System, Blur, Muse, Nirvana, Hot New Contenders Savages. The Banshees' musical influence is everywhere, even if their style legacy mostly hangs off the cheaper stalls at Camden Market. And Siouxsie herself, intelligent, dramatic, individual, diamond hard, she showed women it was possible to do anything they wanted. Be outrageous on a mainstream TV show, make music though you don't know how to play, sing with chilly passion though you come from drab suburbia, look as thrilling as a fairy tale ice queen as you stalk along to Sainsbury's. Siouxsie understood, she understands, that underneath our conventional exteriors, humans are dramatic, magical, tortured beings, living dramatic, magical, tortured lives. And she and the Banshees gave us an amazing choice of soundtracks.
Spellbound, Siouxsie and the Banshees was presented by Miranda Sawyer. The producer was James W. Roberts. And tomorrow, the novelist Jeanette Winterson contemplates the history of the Pendle witch trials of 1612, when a dozen people were accused of murder by witchcraft. The Curse of Pendle is at this time tomorrow.
Meet David Sedaris on BBC Radio 4 Extra.
I like passing time with cashiers, always have. There are 1,000 decent questions. Do you have any friends in wheelchairs? Have you ever had your pupils dilated? Has anyone ever vomited